18 interpreters came through the doors of the Iron Creek Ginseng Company in 14 months. The first one lasted 9 days. The shortest lasted 40 minutes, and she left her badge on the reception counter without a word to anybody. By the end of that year, 2 agencies in the state had stopped returning the company's calls, and the woman those interpreters had been hired for sat in a corner office with a view of 40 acres of shade cloth and had not been asked a real question since the spring. Everyone in that building could tell you what Ma Yervong wanted. Not one of them had heard her say it. And every night at 10:40, a man came in through the loading side with a mop and a cart and a gray string tied around his wrist. And he understood every word she said. And for 11 weeks he said nothing at all. If this one already has hold of you, tap the like button and stay with me. Now let's begin. The floor of the grading room was the coldest floor in the building, and Xiong had learned to mop it first, before his hands warmed up, because once they warmed up the cold felt personal. He came in at 10:40 every night except Sunday. Northline Building Services had 6 accounts in Marathon County, and Iron Creek was the biggest of them. A low-tan complex out on County Road O with a drying barn on one end and offices on the other end. Between them, 4,000 square feet of stainless tables where the roots were graded and weighed. In the day it was loud. At night it was a church. He liked it at night. That was the honest reason he had taken the shift and kept it. There were other reasons he gave people. The hours worked with B's school. The pay was steady. His aunt could sit with the boy until 11 and then he'd be home by 6:30 to make the eggs. And all of those were true. But they were not the reason. The reason was that from 10:40 at night until 6 in the morning, nobody needed anything from him except a clean floor. He was 36. 3 years before, he had been a paramedic. 9 years on the trucks out of the Rothschild station. And he had been good at it. And there were people alive in that county who did not know his name and would not have recognized him in a grocery store. He did not think about that on purpose. It came up on its own sometimes, usually around 3 in the morning, and he mopped through it. The string on his wrist was gray now. It had been white once. Cotton, thin as a shoelace, tied there by an old man at a funeral 3 years ago and never cut. It had frayed at the knot until it was more fuzz than string, and it caught on things. The wringer on the mop bucket, the latch on the utility closet, the cuff of his jacket in winter. His supervisor, Ferd Klatt, had told him twice to take it off, once citing the equipment manual, and once just saying it looked bad. Chai had said he'd think about it. That was 3 years of thinking. He was working the aisle between the second and third grading tables when he heard the door at the far end of the hall. He knew the sound. Everyone who worked nights in that building knew the sound, though most of them worked days and had never heard it. It was the president's office door, and it opened at night maybe 4 times a week, and what came through it was a woman in a gray coat who walked the long way around the outside of the grading room to the drying barn and stood in the door of the barn for a while and then walked back. She had been doing it since the spring. Chai kept mopping. That was the arrangement. Unspoken. Worked out over 11 weeks without either of them ever agreeing to it. She walked. He mopped. Neither of them looked up. He had learned things about her anyway, because you cannot be in a building with one other person at midnight and learn nothing. He had learned that she favored her right side, and that her right hand did not close all the way, and that she carried a legal pad she never wrote on. He had learned that she stopped in the doorway of the drying barn and stood there breathing the smell of it, that ginseng smell, sweet and earthen and a little bitter, like a root cellar and a pharmacy at the same time, and that whatever she was doing in that doorway, it was not inspecting anything. And he had learned, in the second week, that she could not talk. That was not how the building said it. The building said she'd had a stroke. The building said she was recovering. The building said, in the careful voice people use when they think they're being kind, that she was still Ma Yer. Of course she was. She just needed a little more time. What Chai had heard, standing 4 aisles away with a mop in his hands, was a woman trying to say the word scale in English and getting as far as the S 9 times, and then stopping, and then saying, quietly, to nobody. In Hmong, the scale is reading heavy on the left side and somebody moved it. She had said it perfectly, cleanly, full sentence, no hesitation. The way a person says a thing they have said 1,000 times. And then she had gone back to her office. And the next morning the scale had gone on reading heavy. Because there was nobody in that building at 8 in the morning who knew what she had said. That was the first night Chai understood what was actually wrong at Iron Creek, and he mopped the whole grading room twice and did not say one word about it to anyone. 14 months earlier, Ma Vang had been 40 years old and had run the company for 11 years. Her father had started it in 1981 with 9 acres of leased woodland outside Marathon City and a hand-built shade frame he made out of lath and cedar posts. Xiong Vang had come to Wisconsin in 1978 with a wife, 2 children, and no English. And he had done what a great many people in that county had done, which was work at the sawmill, and then work at the cannery, and then, in the summers, hire himself out to the ginseng growers as a digger, which was the worst job on any farm, and paid accordingly. He learned the crop that way, on his knees, for 4 years. And then he leased 9 acres. Ginseng is not a crop that forgives. You put seed in the ground and you wait 4 years, sometimes 5, and every one of those years the crop can be taken from you by rot, by a hot week, by mice, by a 2-day rain in August. And when you finally dig it, that ground is finished. Ginseng poisons the soil behind it. You cannot plant the same field twice, not in your lifetime, not in your children's. Every grower in Marathon County is running out of land at all times, and always has been. Xiong Vang had understood that from the first season, and had built a company around it, leasing woodland from dairy farmers who had no use for it, moving every 4 years, keeping the shade frames modular so they could be pulled and set again on new ground. By 1996, he had 30 growers under contract, most of them Hmong families like his own, and Iron Creek Ginseng was putting Marathon County route on boats to Hong Kong under its own name. Ma Yer had gone to Madison and come back and taken over in her 20s, and she had done one thing her father never did, which was make the company entirely English. She had done it on purpose. She had done it with a memo. Contracts in English, meetings in English, grading sheets in English, phone calls in English. She had told her father, in a kitchen, in a fight she still had whole sentences of memorized, that the old language was a cost, that it was the reason buyers in Chicago talked to him like he was slow, that she was not going to run a company that sounded like a family. He had let her have it. He was 71 and tired and proud of her in a way that had no words in either language. And then, in her 38th year, he got sick, and in the last week of it, sitting up in a bed in the front room with the shades down, he had asked her something in Hmong. She had understood him perfectly. She had answered in English. "I don't understand." He had nodded and turned his face toward the window and did not ask again, and 11 days later he died, and Ma Yer Vang had told exactly no one on this earth what her father's last question had been. 2 years after that, on a Tuesday in June, at her desk, at 9:10 in the morning, a vessel in the left side of her brain closed. She did not die. She was not paralyzed, not in the way people picture. Her right hand went weak and stayed weak, and her right leg dragged for 3 months, and then mostly stopped dragging. What she lost was English. Not all of it. That was the cruelty of it. She could read English fine. She could understand every word anyone said to her in it. She could look at a purchase order and see the error in it in 4 seconds, the way she always had. What she could not do was produce it. The words were behind a door and the door had no handle on her side. She would reach for shipment and get nothing. Reach again and get ship. Reach again and get a long silence and the sound of her own breathing. And by then the room had already moved on and answered the question for her. Hmong came out fine. Not perfectly, but fine. Whole sentences, in order, the first time. The language she had learned at her mother's hip before she was 3. The language she had spent 20 years scrubbing out of her own building. That one had stayed. It had been sitting there the whole time on the other side of the injury, untouched. Like a room in a house that the fire didn't reach. 14 months later, she was still the president of the Iron Creek Ginseng Company, and there was not one person on her payroll she could speak to. The 18 interpreters were her sister's idea. At first, Cabao Vang lived in Fresno and called on Sundays and could not come, and she had done what a person does from 2,000 miles away, which was find agencies and pay them. The first 3 came from a medical interpreting service in Milwaukee. 2 of them were good. 1 of them was excellent. Not one of them lasted more than a month. Chai did not know why yet. He'd heard the number, 18, from a day shift grader named Orville Pelkey, who talked to anybody who stood still. 18 and 14 months, Orville said, shaking his head like it was weather. Woman goes through interpreters like tissues. That was the story the building had settled on, and Chai had let it sit in him for 11 weeks, and it had not gotten any easier to swallow, because he had been watching her and she did not look to him like a woman who ate people. She looked to him like a woman standing in a doorway smelling a barn, because it was the only thing left in that building that still spoke to her. The night it broke open was the 4th Tuesday in September, and it broke open because of a scale. Not the same scale. A different one. The certified bench scale in the grading room. The one every lot got weighed on before it went in the book, and somebody on second shift had leaned a pallet jack against the pedestal and knocked the corner of it out of level. Chai found it because his mop bucket rolled. The floor by table 3 had a slope in it. Always had. That was why he mopped it toward the drain. That night the bucket rolled the wrong way, and he crouched down and saw the shim under the scale pedestal was gone, and the whole bench had walked about a half-inch off its pad. He was still crouched there when the office door opened. She came down the outside aisle in the gray coat. She stopped when she saw him crouched by the scale, and for the first time in 11 weeks she did not keep walking. She came over. She stood on the other side of the bench and looked at the pedestal, and then at him, and then she made a small motion with her left hand, a flat tipping motion like a plate sliding. He nodded. Yeah. He said in English, because that was what he'd said in that building for 11 weeks. Shim's gone. It's sitting about a half-inch out. She said, shh, and stopped. Started again. Shh. She was looking at the pedestal, not at him. And her jaw was tight, and her right hand was pressed flat on the stainless table, because that was what she did when she was working. He had noticed that. She flattened her hand on something. She said. Since. That was the word she got. Since. It was not the word she wanted. And Chai Xiong, who had promised himself 11 weeks ago and 3 years before that, opened his mouth and heard himself say, In Mong, quietly, like a man setting something down. How long has it been out? She looked up. He had thought about it afterward many times that second, and he never could describe it in a way that did it justice. Her face did not light up. It did not soften. What it did was stop. The whole held-together arrangement of it stopped, the way a machine stops when you finally take the load off it, and for about 2 seconds Mayurvong looked at a janitor across a grading table like a person coming up out of water. Then she said, In Mong, fast. And there was nothing wrong with any of it. 3 weeks. It has been 3 weeks. Every lot that has crossed that table for 3 weeks has been weighed heavy, and I have written it on a pad 4 times, and handed the pad to 4 people, and not one of them has read it. Because it is in the wrong language. And I am not going to write it a 5th time. Chai stood up slowly with his rag in his hand. That's about 900 pounds of error, he said. 1,100, she said. I did the arithmetic. Arithmetic still works. They stood there. Somewhere over in the barn the dehumidifier kicked on and ran and shut off. Then she said, You've been here since July. July 8th. You speak it. Yes, you've been in this building at night for 11 weeks. And you speak it. Yes. She said, very evenly, Why didn't you say anything? And Chai Xiong looked at the gray string on his wrist, which had caught on the ringer again, and pulled a little longer, and he said the only true thing he had. Because I don't do that anymore. She waited for the rest of it. There wasn't any rest of it. He picked up his bucket and moved it to the next aisle and went back to work. And after a while she walked out to the barn and stood in the doorway the way she did. And then she went back to her office. And the door closed. He mopped until 6. In the morning, the shim was back under the scale pedestal, cut from a strip of galvanized and set square. And there was a piece of masking tape on the pedestal, with a date written on it in marker in a hand nobody in that building recognized. Nobody asked. Nobody ever asked about anything that got fixed at night. Xiong was 7, and he collected words. Not the way other kids collected things. He didn't keep them in a box. He kept them on the backs of receipts, which he took out of his father's jacket pockets, and out of the drawer by the phone, and out of the recycling. And he wrote on them in a pencil he sharpened with a paring knife. Because he'd seen his father do it once, and had decided that was how it was done. The rule, which he had made himself and never explained, was that a word went on a receipt if he heard it, and nobody would tell him what it meant. There were a lot of receipts. Contraindicated, B said, at 6:40 in the morning, over eggs. Chai poured the coffee. Where'd you get that one? The TV at Auntie's. It means the thing that would normally help you would hurt you instead. Because of some other thing that's already going on. B thought about that with his whole face. The way he did. So it's a good thing that turned bad because of a different thing. Close enough. Okay, he wrote something on the receipt. Not the definition. Chai had looked once. And his son didn't write definitions. He wrote the date. Every word had the date he'd finally gotten it. That was the part that got Chai, on the mornings when he was too tired to have his guard up. The kid was keeping a record of how long he'd had to wait. They lived in a rented half of a duplex on the north side of Wausau. 11 minutes from the school. 22 from Iron Creek. Chai's aunt, Mrs. Ku, lived 4 houses down and sat with B from 10 at night until Chai got home. It worked. It had worked for a year and a half. It was not the life he'd pictured, but he had stopped picturing lives, which was its own kind of relief. Pania had been gone 3 years in November. She had gone into the hospital on a Thursday for something routine. The doctors used that word, routine, and everyone kept using it right up until they stopped, and she had done well, and she had been sitting up on Saturday. On Sunday afternoon, a clot moved out of her leg and into her lung. Chai had been in the room. He had been in the room the whole time because he was her husband, and also because he was a paramedic, and the nurses treated him a little differently for that, gave him a little more room, spoke to him a little faster, and with more words in them. And Pania's English had been fine for the grocery store, and thin for anything else. Not gone. Thin, the way a fourth language is thin. So when the doctor came in on Sunday at 5:20 and said the things doctors say, Chai had turned to his wife and put it into Hmong for her, the way he had done at 100 appointments over 11 years of marriage, and he had made one change. 1. The doctor had said they were not confident they could get ahead of it. Chai had said, they're working on it, and they think there's time. 2 hours later there wasn't. She had died believing there was time. And she had not said the things a person says when there is not time. And there had been a lot of those things. Because they had been married 11 years and they had a 4-year-old, and there had been so much left to say. Chai had told nobody. Not his aunt, not her family. Not one person at the funeral where an old man had tied a white string around his wrist and said the words over him. He had gone back on shift after 2 weeks. He had lasted 5 months. What ended it wasn't a bad call. What ended it was a good one. A woman on a kitchen floor in Schofield, with a family around her who didn't have English. And the daughter had looked at him with total relief when he'd started speaking. That specific relief. Finally, someone who can tell us. And Chai had stood in that kitchen with his hands on a stranger's chest, and understood that every one of those people was about to believe whatever he chose to say. He wrote his resignation that night. He had not translated anything for anybody in 3 years. Not at the clinic, not at the school, Not at the courthouse when Mrs. Quay got a jury summons and cried about it. Not once. He had told people he was out of practice. He had told his aunt he was tired. He had never once told anyone the actual sentence, which was, "I am not a safe person to put in the middle." That was the man Maier Vong had just found in her grading room at midnight. She did not push. That was the first surprising thing. He'd braced for it. For the ask. For the reasonable escalating pressure of a woman who owned the building he mopped. He had drafted the refusal in his head on the drive home. 3 or 4 versions of it. Some polite, one not. She never asked. What she did instead was worse in a way. Because there was no version of it he could refuse. She started talking. Not to him. Near him. She'd come down the aisle at 11:15 and stop at the end of a grading table and stand there with her hand flat on the stainless. And she would say, in Hmong, to the room, to the tables, to nobody. The Cluck lease is up in March and Selk hasn't signed the renewal because he thinks the ground's spent. It isn't spent. It's got one more season of shade in it if you rotate the frames east. And Chai would mop. Somebody moved the second-year seed to the north cooler. That cooler swings 4 degrees at night. In 8 weeks, that's a dead lot. And Chai would mop. My father called this room the church. He said you don't talk in it. He talked in it constantly. Chai's mop stopped for about 2 seconds on that one. And she saw it. And neither of them acknowledged it. And he started again. It went on like that for 9 nights. On the 10th night, she said, you could just tell somebody about the cooler. You wouldn't have to say where you heard it. He said, in English, "Ma'am, I'm the custodian." She said, in Hmong, "That is not a no. That is a job title." He didn't answer that. But at 4 in the morning he taped a note to the north cooler door that said compressor short cycling, check set point, unsigned. And by Thursday the seed had been moved to the south cooler, and a service tech had come out. And nobody ever asked who wrote the note. Because nobody in that building ever asked about anything that got fixed at night. Arden Selk had been at Iron Creek for 11 months. He was 54. He had come out of a food ingredients company in the Twin Cities. And the family trust had brought him in 6 weeks after the stroke with the title of interim president, which was a title constructed to avoid a fight. He had a good handshake. He remembered the names of people's kids. He had, in 11 months, done a number of genuinely useful things. Renegotiated the freight. Cleaned up a receivables mess that had been rotting since before the stroke. Put a real cold chain on the seed. He was not a bad man. And Chai would think about that a great deal later. Because it would have been so much easier if he had been. What Arden Selk had done was simpler than villainy. He had walked into a company where the president could not speak. And he had built a way to run it anyway. And the way he had built ran on summaries. The interpreter would sit in on the meeting. The interpreter would render what Maier said, and the minutes would record, not what she said, but a summary of what she said. Prepared afterward. Approved by Selk's office. Filed by the corporate secretary. That was it. That was the whole mechanism. It was not illegal. In most companies it wouldn't even have been notable. Except that the summaries were shorter than the sentences. And they were shorter in a direction. Chai learned this from Cheryl Dombrowski, who had been Maier's assistant for 9 years, and was now technically Selk's. And who came in early on Thursdays and overlapped with the end of his shift. And who talked because she was miserable and he was there. 18, she said, one Thursday in early October, with her coat still on. You know how many of them quit versus got let go? No, 14 quit. She said it the way you set down something heavy. 14 out of 18. Agencies think she's impossible. She's not impossible. You want to know what happens? Chai leaned on the mop. He should not have leaned on the mop. They come in, Cheryl said. Good ones. Some of them. Real ones. Certified. And she talks, and they render it, and it's long. Because she was always long, she explains things, that's how she is. And then Arden says, very nice, very reasonable. Let's just capture the gist for the record. And the first time, they do it. And the second time, they do it. And by the third or fourth week, they're the one deciding which 2/3 of their client's sentence goes in the book. She pulled her gloves off finger by finger, and the good ones can't sleep. So they quit. Chai didn't say anything. "Number 11, Cheryl said. "Young gal, Pang Foa. She lasted 5 weeks and she went out of here white as a sheet." She looked at him. "You didn't hear any of this from me." "I didn't hear any of it at all," Chai said, and went and got the vacuum. He saw it happen 4 days later, which was worse than hearing about it. Northline did a supply drop on the first Tuesday of every month and somebody had to sign for it. And that October the somebody was him. Which meant coming in at 8 in the morning on 3 hours of sleep and standing in a hallway with a clipboard while a driver counted cases of liner bags. The conference room was glass on the hallway side. There were 9 people in it. Selk at the head, 2 men from the co-op, Cheryl with a laptop, 4 growers, Ma Yer at the far end, and, at her shoulder, in a gray blazer, a woman Chai had never seen, which meant she was number 18. He could not hear anything through the glass. That was the thing that made it unbearable. He watched it the way you watch a television with the sound off, which is the way you find out what a thing actually looks like. He watched Ma Yer talk. She talked for a long time. 25, 30 seconds, maybe more. Her left hand moving, her right one flat on the table. Her head coming up at the end of it the way a person's head comes up when they've finished a thought and are handing it over. He watched number 18 listen. He watched her render it. 11 seconds. He counted, because he could not help counting, because there had been 9 years of his life in which counting was most of the job. 11 seconds for something that had taken over 30. And then he watched Arden Selk nod, kindly, and say something to Cheryl, and Cheryl type it, and one of the co-op men ask a question, and he watched number 18 answer it herself. Not translate it. Answer it. Turn to the man and give him what was plainly a clarification, 12 or 15 words of her own, without turning back to the woman whose sentence it had been. And then, he watched Ma Yer Vang open her mouth to correct it, and get one syllable out, and stop, and put her hand flat on the table, and not try again. The room moved on. It moved on smoothly and comfortably, and nobody in it did one identifiable wrong thing. And the meeting ran another 40 minutes. And at the end of it, everybody stood up and shook hands and Selk held the door. The driver said, "Sir, I need the second page." Chai signed the second page. He drove home and did not sleep. He lay on the bed on top of the blanket with his boots off and his coat on, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the 11 seconds. Because here is what he knew, and what almost nobody who has not done it knows. It is not hard to shorten somebody. It is the easiest thing in the world. It does not feel like lying. It feels like helping. You have a room full of people whose time is worth money, and a speaker whose sentence has a subordinate clause in it, and you are the only person in the room who can see both ends of the bridge. And every instinct you have, every single one, including the good ones, especially the good ones, tells you to carry the meaning and leave the rest. And the first time you do it, the meaning survives. That's the trap. It survives the first time, and the second time, and the 9th. And then one afternoon the meaning is we are not confident we can get ahead of this, and you have had 900 repetitions of practice at deciding what somebody can carry, and your hands do it before your conscience gets a vote. Chai got up at 2 in the afternoon and made eggs he didn't eat. That night he came in at 10:40 and she was already in the folding chair. She said, "In Hmong, you were in the building this morning. Supply drop. You watched the meeting. Some of it." She was quiet for a second. What did it look like from out there? And Chai Xiong, who had promised himself that he would not, who had held that line for 11 weeks and then some, heard himself tell her the truth. It looked like a room full of people, he said, listening very respectfully to somebody who wasn't in it. Ma Yer nodded slowly. That's her 4th week, she said. She'll be gone by Friday. She's good, she was very good. The first 3 days. That's how you can tell. The bad ones last. Does she know she's doing it? She knows, Maier said. She has known since about day 9. That's what the blazer is for. Chai didn't understand that. She started wearing it in week 2, Maier said. They all do something. One of them started bringing her own pen. One of them started sitting up very straight. She looked at the dark grading room. When people are doing something that's making them sick, they get formal about it. That's how you know it's costing them. The ones it doesn't cost, they slouch. She was gone by Thursday, in fact, not Friday. Chai found out, because there was a badge on the reception counter at 10:40 at night with nobody's name on it, face down, and nothing else. And he picked it up and put it in the lost and found drawer with 4 other ones. There were 9 badges in that drawer. He counted those, too. He thought about it for 2 days, and it did not get better with thinking. That was the thing that got its hooks in him. Not the woman in the gray coat. Not yet. The mechanism. A room in which a person spoke and a shorter version of it went into the record. And everyone in the room believed they were being helpful, and the person spoke less and less. Because what was the point? And eventually the record was the only version left, and the record was a lie that nobody had told on purpose. He knew exactly how much shorter a sentence could get. He knew it to the word. October came in cold and stayed. The digging season was close now. You could feel the whole county tighten around it. And the shade cloth started coming off the gardens in strips, and the crews got longer, and the offices at Iron Creek filled up in a way they hadn't all summer. Maier's night walks got shorter. She stopped going all the way to the barn. She stood in the cross corridor by the grading room door with her coat on and looked out at the yard lights. And one night in the 2nd week of October, Chai came around the end of table 1 with his cart and found her standing there with her eyes closed. She was humming. It was low, barely anything, and he almost went past it. It was a tune he half knew from somewhere, church, or a store, or the radio in a truck 20 years ago. A slow one, 4 beats to the bar. He stopped, because she wasn't just humming. Underneath it, riding along on the tune, she was making words. Not clearly, not all of them. But there were consonants in there that were not Hmong consonants. And there were shapes his ear knew, and about 6 seconds in she came out of a phrase clean and audible, and unmistakably in English. 4 words. In tune. In rhythm. With no hesitation in them at all. Then she opened her eyes and saw him and stopped. They stood there. She said, in Hmong, it doesn't count. What doesn't? That. She made a short dismissive motion with her left hand. They told me about it at the hospital. It's not speech. The tune carries it. It's a party trick. Everybody can do it apparently. It doesn't come off the tune. She pulled her coat closed. I don't need a party trick. I need to be able to say the word shipment in a room with a lawyer in it. Chai said nothing. He had a very specific feeling in his chest, and he did not know yet what to do with it. And he had learned 3 years ago to be extremely careful with the things he thought he knew. But he had run calls for 9 years, and he had a paramedic's ear for the difference between a symptom and a signal. And what he had just heard was not a party trick. It was a road. He mopped the corridor twice that night, and did not say one word about it. And he did not know it then, but that was the last night for a long time that not saying something was going to be an option. 2 nights later, she brought him a chair. He came in at 10:40, and there was a folding chair set at the end of grading table 3, facing the aisle he mopped, and she was already sitting in it with the untouched legal pad in her lap. He looked at the chair. He looked at her. She said, in Hmong, I'm not asking you for anything. I'm going to talk. You're going to mop. Those are 2 separate activities that happen to be occurring in the same room. That's not how it works, Chai said in English. Then correct me, she said. In whatever language you like. He mopped. She talked. She talked about the crop, mostly. That was the safe country, and they both stayed in it for the first week. 4-year root and 5-year root, and why the county's soil made the rings tight. Why the Asian buyers paid a premium for Wisconsin. And how much of what got sold as Wisconsin wasn't. How a grower can lose an entire season in 11 hours of the wrong August. How her father had leased ground from a dairyman named Cluck in 1984 with a handshake. And how Maynard Cluck's grandson still leased to them. And how that handshake was worth more than the contract, because the contract was in English, and old man Cluck couldn't have told you what half of it said either. Chai mopped and listened, and answered when he had to, which was about once a night, in short sentences, in Hmong, because it had become ridiculous to answer her in English. That was the crack. It was not a moment. It was a slow leak, and it went on for 2.5 weeks, and by the end of it he was answering 3 or 4 times a night, and had started leaving the cart in one place instead of pushing it, which meant he was doing less mopping, which meant something. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Nothing was wrong with her at all except one door. "You were something before this," she said one night. "Nobody mops like that." "Like what?" "Like a man who's used to being the only one awake." He wrung the mop out. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "Paramedic," he said. 9 years. She turned that over. "And you quit." "I quit." "Why?" And he said, "Because I found out what I'd do under pressure," and picked up the cart and moved it, and she let him go. Which surprised him. She let him go a lot. He had expected her to be relentless. She was not relentless. She was patient in a way that had a floor under it, and it took him a long time to understand what he was seeing, which was a woman who had spent 14 months on the receiving end of people deciding what she was ready for, and had come out the other side of it constitutionally unable to do that to somebody else. He brought B once. It was not planned. Mrs. Kui had a gallbladder thing on a Thursday, and there was nowhere to put a 7-year-old at 10:30 at night. And Ferd Klatt said the word liability twice on the phone, and then said fine once. Keep him out of the plant floor. B walked into the Iron Creek offices at 10:40 at night with a pencil and a fold of receipts, and looked around the reception area the way he looked at everything, which was completely. "It smells," he said. "That's the root. It smells like the inside of a tree." Mayer came out of her office at 11 and stopped when she saw a child sitting cross-legged on the floor of her reception area writing on the back of a gas station receipt. B looked up at her. He did not do the thing kids do. He looked at her right hand, which she was holding the way she held it, and then at her face. And then he said, "Are you the boss of the whole building?" She looked at Chai. Chai said, in Hmong, "He asked if you're the boss of the whole building." She said in Hmong, "Tell him I am the president, and that means I am the boss of everything except the building." Chai opened his mouth to render it, and stopped, and something went through him that he did not have a name for at the time, because he had just been asked to be exactly the thing he had spent 3 years refusing to be, and it had happened so fast and so easily that he'd nearly done it before noticing. He rendered it. All of it. He did not shorten it. B absorbed this. "What's president mean?" "It means she's in charge." "That's not what she said." Chai looked at his son. "She said a longer thing," B said. "You said a shorter thing." The reception area was very quiet. Chai said, "You're right. She said she's the president, and that means she's in charge of everything except the building." "Why not the building?" "Because somebody else owns it and rents it to her." Oh, B wrote something on the receipt. Then he held it up to Mayer, 6 inches from her face, with the total confidence of a person who has never once been ignored. "How do you spell president?" She looked at it. Her mouth moved. "P," she said. That was all of it. One letter, and then the door shut on the rest, and Chai watched a woman who ran a company stand in her own lobby, unable to give a 7-year-old the second letter of a word she had written on her own office door. B waited. He waited a full 5 seconds, which for him was an eternity, and he did not fill it, and he did not look away. Then he said, "That's okay. I'll get the rest later," and wrote a large P on the receipt, and, next to it, the date. Maier said, "In Hmong." Very quietly. "What did he say?" Chai told her. "Exactly." She stood there for a moment. Then she went back into her office, and the door closed, and she did not come out again that night, and Chai finished the offices and the grading room and the corridor, and did not know whether he had just done something good or something unforgivable. 3 days later she started leaving him things. Not notes. She could write English perfectly well. That was the other cruelty of it. Writing came from a different room in the house. But she didn't leave notes. She left the grading books. The first one was on table 3, open, with a pen laid in the gutter. It was the 1994 book, her father's, and it was in Hmong. Every line of it, every lot, every weight, every grower, every price. 40 pages of a language that had not been permitted in that building since she was 29 years old. The second night there were 3 books. The third night there were 11, stacked, going back to 1983, and Maier was sitting at the end of the table with her hand flat on the stainless, and she said, in Hmong, before he could ask, "There are 206 of these. They're in a cabinet in the barn office that nobody has opened since I took over. They are the only complete record of what came out of what ground in this county for 43 years. And there is not one person left in this company who can read a single line of them." She let that sit. "Except you," she said. Apparently, Chai put down the mop. He stood there in the cold room with 206 books worth of a dead man's handwriting stacked in front of him, and he thought about a doctor at 5:20 on a Sunday. And he thought about a boy on the floor of a lobby, waiting for a second letter. And he thought about the sentence he had carried for 3 years, which was, "I am not a safe person to put in the middle." And he heard himself say, "I'll read them to you. That's not interpreting. That's reading." Maier Vong looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Fine, we'll call it reading," and pulled the 1983 book toward her. And that was how it started. They read for 19 nights. It was not fast. Chongvang's handwriting was small and slanted, and he abbreviated everything. And there were 4 spellings of the same grower's name across 3 decades. And about every 8th page he had written something in the margin that had nothing to do with ginseng at all. The weather, a birth, a note that the 6-mile bridge was out. Chai read out loud, and Maier wrote in English on the legal pad she had carried unmarked for 14 months. And by the 6th night the pad was full, and she had started a second one. And by the 10th night the second one was full, and she had gone into the supply closet and come out with a box of them. What was in the books was a map. Not of the ground. Ginseng ground is used once and dead. The ground in those books was worthless the day after it was dug. What was in the books was people. 206 volumes of who had grown for Iron Creek, and where they were, and how much they'd put in, and what they'd been paid, and... This was the part that made Maier stop writing for a full minute on the 11th night. How they had left, because they had left. That was the story the books told when you laid 43 years of them end to end. In 1996, there had been 31 grower families under contract with Iron Creek. Now there were 9. And the drop was not gradual, and it was not economic. It happened in a cluster. 22 families went out over 4 years. Starting in the year Maier Vong took over and put every contract into English. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said, in Hmong, flat, without any performance in it at all, the thing she had never said to anyone. She said that she had known. Not at first. At first she had believed the story, which was that the old growers were aging out, and their kids didn't want the work, and that was just what happened to farms. She had believed it for about 6 years. And then in 2013, a woman named Sia Thao had come into the office to sign a renewal, and had sat with the contract in front of her for 11 minutes, and had then said she'd take it home to her son, and had never come back. And Maier had understood in that moment exactly what she was watching, and had let it happen anyway, because fixing it would have required her to walk into the room where her father was and say out loud that he had been right. He had died 4 years after that. She had never said it. And the last thing he ever asked her, in the front room with the shades down, in the language she had spent 20 years removing from his company, was who was going to talk to them when he was gone. She had understood him perfectly. She had said, in English, that she didn't understand. She told Chai all of that in about 90 seconds, in a cold room, at 1 in the morning, with her hand flat on a stainless table, in the tone of a woman reading a weight off a scale. When she was done, she did not look at him for a reaction, and she did not soften it, and she did not cry, and she picked up the pen and said, 1997. Keep going. Chai kept going, but he did not sleep that day, and at 3 in the afternoon he got up and drove out to a farm road east of Marathon City, and sat in his truck looking at a field where there had been a shade garden in 1997, according to a book. And there was nothing there now but corn stubble, and a line of cedar posts somebody had never bothered to pull. Thornberry came in the 3rd week of October. Chai saw the folder before he heard the name. It was on the corner of the reception desk at 10:40 at night, with a rubber band around it, and a post-it that said Selk signature copy. And he did not open it, because he was a janitor and the folder was not his. He mentioned it to Maier, because he mentioned everything to her now, which was itself a thing that had happened without either of them agreeing to it. She went very still. Get it, she said. It's not mine to get. It's my company. Then get it yourself. She looked at him for a second. Then she went and got it herself and brought it back to grading table 3 and opened it and read it. And Chai went on mopping and watched her read it out of the side of his eye, and he watched her get to page 4 and stop. She read page 4 3 times. Then she said, in Hmong, read this to me. It's in English. You read English. I know I read English, she said. Read it to me anyway. I need to hear it in a voice. So he read it. Thornbury Botanical Group was a bulk botanical supplier out of Illinois. What the agreement said, in 11 pages of extremely clean English, was that Iron Creek would sell its entire standing crop, all 40 acres, 4-year root, the whole season, to Thornberry as unsorted bulk, priced by the pound, delivered green, taken off the field at the point of harvest. Green, off the field. Unsorted. Chai did not know the industry, but he had read 206 grading books out loud in 19 nights, and he had learned exactly one thing about ginseng that mattered, which was that everything Iron Creek was worth lived in the sorting. The premium was in the grading. Wisconsin root sold for what it sold for, because somebody had put hands on every piece of it, and put it in a class, and put the farm's name on the box. Root that goes into a bulk trailer green and unsorted and gets blended with somebody else's root in a warehouse in Illinois isn't Wisconsin root anymore. It isn't Iron Creek root. It is material. It's worth about 1/5 as much, and it comes out the other end in a bag with somebody else's name on it. Why would you sign this? Chai said. I wouldn't, she said. Somebody did. She turned to the last page. There was a signature block, and it was not signed yet, and above it there was a paragraph in 9-point type that said the signatory was executing the agreement on behalf of Ma Yervong, President, pursuant to a durable power of attorney, dated the 14th of August of the prior year. 14th of August. 6 weeks and 2 days after the stroke. Maier put the folder down on the stainless table and put both hands flat on it, the weak one and the strong one, and said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then she said, in Hmong, I remember the day. I remember a room, and a notary, and a woman interpreting. I remember being tired in a way I cannot describe to you. I remember that I could not read it, because at 6 weeks I could not track a line of print for more than 4 words without losing the front of it, and that came back in December, and by then it was filed. What did the interpreter tell you it was? That it was so the company could keep running while I got better. Was it? That is what it is, she said. Read it again. Every word of it is true. It is a document that lets the company keep running while I get better. It just also does this. Chai stood there with the mop. Who was the interpreter? He said. She looked at him. I don't know, she said. I never saw her again. I want to say she was young. Chai went home at 6 in the morning and sat in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes and thought about a woman named Pong Foa who had left that building white as a sheet. The clock was the freeze. That was the thing nobody outside the county understood about the ginseng calendar. There is no board meeting. There is no closing date. There is a stretch of about 3 weeks when the tops have died back and the root has pulled everything down into itself, and the ground is still soft enough to dig, and after that the frost goes in, and the ground locks and whatever is under it stays under it, and comes up rotten in the spring. Every grower in Marathon County spends October looking at the sky. Iron Creek's 40 acres, the last 4-year block, the good block, the one out on the Cluck ground, would come out of the ground in a window that was going to open in about 11 days, and close when the first hard freeze went in, which the almanac put around the 22nd, and which everybody knew could come on the 12th. And on the day it came out, under the terms of the agreement, a Thornberry trailer would be sitting at the end of the row. Once it went in that trailer green and unsorted, there was no argument left to have. You cannot unblend a crop. You cannot go to a court in March and ask for $400,000 of grading premium back out of a bag in Illinois. The wrong thing would simply have happened, permanently, in about 4 hours, on a cold morning, with everybody standing right there watching it, and nobody doing anything wrong. Warner Tice came out to look at the block on the 25th. Chai wasn't there. He was asleep. But Cheryl told him about it Thursday with her coat still on. And what Cheryl said was that Thornberry's procurement man had walked the rows with Selk for an hour and had been perfectly pleasant, and that at the end of it he had said, in front of 4 people, that he was glad they'd found a solution that took the pressure off. Given everything. Given everything. 2 words. Nobody in that group had asked what he meant. Because everybody knew, and because Ma Yervong had not been on the walk. She had not been invited. She had been in her office, 40 feet away, with the door open. That was the night she stopped talking about the crop. She came down at 11 and sat in the folding chair and said in Hmong, I want you to interpret for me at the growers' meeting on the 2nd. Chai said, No, I'm not asking you to work for me. I'll pay the agency rate, Al. No. Why? And he told her. He had not planned to. He had planned, if it ever came up, to give her the version he gave everyone, which was that he was out of practice, and that she deserved a certified professional, and that he was not going to be responsible for a company's contracts. That version was sitting right there in his mouth, fully formed. What came out instead was Sunday, 5:20, and a doctor with a folder, and a woman sitting up in bed with a bruise on her hand from the IV, and the exact English words we are not confident we can get ahead of this, and the exact Hmong words he had put in their place. He said it flat. He did not put a shape on it. He got to the end and there was nothing at the end. No lesson, just the 2 hours, and then the not 2 hours. Ma Yer listened to all of it without moving. When he was done, she said, Why did you do it? Because I couldn't say it to her face. No, she said. That's why it was easy. Why did you do it? Chai stood there for a while. Because I thought I was giving her a good afternoon, he said. And I was. And it wasn't mine to give. She nodded slowly, once. There it is, she said. And then she said the thing that took the floor out from under him, which was, Do you know how many people have done that to me in 14 months? Give me a good afternoon? He did not answer. 18 interpreters, she said. 14 of them quit. Do you know why they quit? Because a very kind man asked them to capture the gist. And they did it, and it made them sick, and they left, and every single one of them was a better person than the 4 who stayed. She stood up. You are the only person I have met since June of last year who knows exactly what it costs to make somebody smaller, so the room can move faster, she said. That is not a disqualification. That is the entire qualification. Chai said. It's the reason I stopped. I know, she said. That's how I know you'd do it right. He worked the growers' meeting. He told himself it was one meeting. He told himself he was not an interpreter. He was a man who happened to be in a room, and that distinction lasted about 4 minutes into the 2nd of November. There were 14 people in the conference room at Iron Creek that morning, which was 9 grower families and Selk and Cheryl, and 2 men from the co-op. Chai had come in at 7:30 after his shift, in a clean shirt, with 3 hours of sleep, and he sat at Mayer's right hand. Selk was gracious about it. That was the thing. He shook Chai's hand and said he was glad they'd found somebody and asked, pleasantly, whether Chai was certified. No, sir, Chai said. Well, Selk said, let's just keep it simple then, GIST is fine. And Mayer Vang, sitting 6 inches away, said, in Hmong, in a completely level voice, tell him no. Chai said, she says no. The room went quiet in a way that conference rooms do not usually go quiet. Selk smiled. No to, tell him, Mayer said, that for 14 months this company's minutes have recorded a summary of my sentences prepared after the fact by people who were not in the room when I said them. And that as of this morning, that practice ends. Tell him every word I say in this building goes in the record. Not the gist. The words, and tell him that if he would like a summary, he is welcome to prepare one, and to file it separately, under his own name, as his own opinion of what I said. Chai rendered it. All of it. He did not shorten it. It took 19 seconds. Arden Selk did not get angry. He looked at Mayer for a moment, and then he looked at Chai, and something in his face rearranged itself in a way that Chai would think about later. Not hostility. Recalculation. The look of a man who has just learned that a door he had believed was closed has a handle on the other side after all. Of course, he said. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 2 hours longer than any Iron Creek growers meeting in 14 months. Because Mayer Vang talked, and every word of it got said out loud in a language 9 of the people in that room had grown up in. Chai watched it happen. He watched Xiatao's son, who was 34, and had come only because his mother made him, uncross his arms about 40 minutes in. He watched a man named Tong Yang ask a question about the 3rd-year seed that he had apparently been sitting on for 2 years. He watched Maynard Cluck, who was 78 and did not speak a word of Hmong and was the only white grower in the room, lean over to Cheryl at one point and say, audibly, this is the most I've understood in a year, and I don't understand any of it. And he watched Mayer, at the 2-hour mark, get to the Thornberry Agreement, and lay it out page by page, and stop at the last one, and say, and Chai rendered it exactly, that a document had been signed on her behalf 6 weeks after her stroke, in a room where she could not read a line of print, and that she had been told it was so the company could keep running, and that she was going to find out who had told her that. Nobody moved. Then Maynard Cluck said, into the silence, well hell, my lease is up in March. Which was, Chai understood about a half-second later, an old man's way of saying I'm still here. It fell apart 11 days later. It fell apart the way these things do, which is not from the direction anybody is watching. Dr. Colleen Vitale had been Mayer's speech-language pathologist since the 4th month. She came out from the hospital system in Marshfield, twice a month, and she was by every measure excellent. She had gotten Mayer from nothing to functional reading. She had built the compensatory strategies. She had fought the insurance twice. And she had, over 14 months, formed a professional view, which was that the English was not coming back. The lesion was where it was. The window was what it was. Her clinical position, documented, was that continued pursuit of expressive English recovery at this stage was likely to produce frustration, depression, and withdrawal, and that the right goal was a rich, functional life in the language her patient had. It was not an unkind position. It was, most likely, correct, and then on the 6th of November she came for a session and found her patient sitting in a folding chair in a grading room at 9 in the morning with a night janitor, doing something Dr. Vitali had never authorized, taught, or approved, which was singing. They had been at it for 6 days. It had started the way things between them started, sideways, without anybody deciding. Chai had asked her one night what the tune was. She had said it was something from a store. He had said his wife used to do that, sing along in English to things she couldn't have held a conversation in, and Maier had gone quiet for a second, and then said, "Everybody does that." And he had said, "Right. So it's not a trick, it's just how it works." And she had said nothing, and 4 nights later she had come in with a phone with 11 songs on it. By the 6th day she could get 11 words out inside the tune. Not out of it. Inside it. The second she dropped the melody, the door shut. But 11 words was 11 more than since, and both of them knew perfectly well that they were doing something without permission. Dr. Vitali watched from the doorway for about 90 seconds. Then she asked to speak to Maier alone, and what she said in that room was measured and careful and, Chai would later concede, entirely defensible. She said that melodic intonation work was a real modality, that it was also a specific clinical protocol with a structure and a screening process and criteria, that doing it ad hoc with an unlicensed person carried real risk of entrenching maladaptive patterns, and that she could not in good conscience continue as the treating clinician while it went on. And then, she did the other thing, which she also believed she had to do. She reported it, not to the police. Nothing so dramatic. She noted it in the record and she raised a concern with the company's HR contact, who was Cheryl, who had to walk it to Selk. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon there was a phone call from Northline Building Services to a man asleep in a duplex on the north side of Wausau. Ferd Klatt was apologetic about it, and it did not help. The account had raised a concern about a Northline employee performing unlicensed clinical services on client premises outside the scope of the janitorial contract. Northline's insurance carrier had a position on that. Chai was off the Iron Creek account effective immediately. There were other accounts. There was a school in Mosinee. 3rd shift. $1.10 less an hour. Ferd, Chai said. I mopped a floor and read a book out loud. I know it, Ferd said. I know it. It ain't about what happened. And it wasn't. That was the thing that would eat at him for weeks. Nobody in that chain had done a single wrong thing. A clinician protected her patient. An HR contact escalated a documented concern. A carrier wrote an exclusion. A supervisor followed it. Every link was correct, and the chain came out the far end and took the one person out of the building who could hear her. Selk came to see him. That was the part Chai had not braced for. It was the next afternoon, and Selk came to the duplex, and he stood on the step in a good coat, and did not ask to come in. I want to say something and then I'll go, Selk said. I'm not your enemy. I think you probably think I am. Chai waited. When I came in here, that woman couldn't finish a sentence, and there were $900 and some thousand of receivables sitting uncollected and a seed cooler running 4 degrees hot, Selk said. I have kept this company alive for 11 months. I did not enjoy any of it. And I'd like you to understand that the Thornberry deal is not a robbery. It is what you do when you have a crop coming out of the ground in 10 days, no functioning sales function, a president who cannot make a phone call, and a note payment in January. You could have asked her. I did ask her. Selk's jaw moved. For 14 months I asked her. And what I got back was silence, or 4 words, or an interpreter telling me she'd said something long that came out short. You've been here 4 months. I've been in that room since August of last year. He looked away, at the street. You think I liked the summaries? I hated the summaries. They were the only thing that let the company have a record at all. Chai said, the record was wrong. Yes, Selk said, it was. And then, Because he was not a bad man. And because he had come here to do one thing and had not yet done it, he took an envelope out of his coat. "There's something in your file," he said. "I didn't go looking. It came up when the carrier ran the exclusion. Complaint from 3 years ago. Marathon County Ems. A family in Schofield. Nothing came of it. It was withdrawn. No finding. But it's a language complaint." Chai's mouth went dry. "I'm not going to use it," Selk said. "I want to be clear. That's not what this is." He put the envelope in Chai's hand. "But if you come back into that building and stand next to her in a room with Thornberry's counsel in it, somebody else will pull it. And it will not be me. And it will land on her, not you." He stepped back off the step. "She has enough. That's all. She has enough." He went and got in his car and drove away. Chai stood in the door for a long time. The complaint was nothing. He knew what it was before he opened it. The Schofield kitchen. The daughter. A follow-up call from a supervisor about scope. Withdrawn in 9 days. It was nothing. It was also, in 11 lines of county paperwork, the single-sentence concern raised regarding accuracy of on-scene interpretation by responding medic. He was still holding it when he realized B was standing in the hallway behind him. Who was that guy? Nobody. B looked at the envelope. B looked at his father. Was he from where you go at night? Yes. Are you not going there anymore? Chai said. No, I'm not. And B Xiong, who was 7, and who had been collecting the words his father wouldn't give him since he was 4 years old, said, Because you did something wrong? Chai opened his mouth. And what came out was, No. It's complicated. B stood there. Then he turned around and went into his room and shut the door quietly, which he never did. And Chai heard the drawer where the receipts were, and he stood in his own hallway and understood that he had just been asked a real question and had handed his son a summary. The school in Mosini had 1,100 feet of terrazzo in the main corridor, and Chai mopped it 8 nights in a row and did not hear one word from Iron Creek. He told himself that was correct. He had been a contractor's employee on a client site. There was no relationship to end. She had a company coming apart around a crop that was going in the grounds last week, and she had a lawyer somewhere, and she had Cheryl, and she had 18 agencies worth of phone numbers. On the 4th night, he caught himself checking the almanac on his phone at 2 in the morning to see where the freeze line was. On the 6th night, he drove out County Road O on the way home, which was 11 miles out of the way, and slowed down at the cluck ground and looked at the black tops of 40 acres of ginseng lying dead back under the shade frames the way they were supposed to. And he thought, 11 days, maybe 9, and drove on. On the 8th night he came home at 6:40 in the morning, and B was already up, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with the light off, with a shoebox in front of him. I want to ask you a word, B said. Chai stopped in the doorway with his keys in his hand. Okay. B took the lid off. Inside were receipts. Hundreds of them, folded twice. Banded in bundles of about 50. And the bundles were in order, because of course they were. He took one out of the very bottom bundle. It was old. The thermal print had gone completely blank. Just a gray strip of nothing. And on the back of it, in the enormous shaky uppercase of a 4-year-old, was a word spelled the way a 4-year-old spells what he hears. Survivable. And under it, a date. Written in a different hand. In Panhia's handwriting. Because she had still been alive that morning, and the boy had asked her to write the date, and she had written it. Chai put his keys on the counter very carefully. I heard it at the hospital, B said. The doctor said it. I asked Mom what it meant. And she said, ask Dad. And then I asked you and you said it was a grown-up word. He turned the receipt over and back. I've asked you 4 times since. You said complicated 2 times and later 1 time and 1 time you didn't say anything. He looked up. I'm 7 now, he said. You always tell me the short one. There is no way to describe what that does to a person. Chai sat down at the kitchen table across from his son in a coat he had not taken off, at 6:40 in the morning, with a shoebox between them, and he understood that he had been standing in the exact same room for 3 years, and had gotten very good at mopping it. "Do you want the whole one?" he said. B said, "Yes." So he gave it to him. He told a 7-year-old that survivable means a thing you can live through, and that the doctor had used it in a sentence with the word "not" in front of it, and that the sentence meant the doctors did not think his mother was going to live. He told him the doctor had said it at 5:20 in the afternoon. He told him that Mom had not understood English well enough to catch it herself, and that she had turned and looked at Dad, because that was what she always did, and that Dad had said it back to her in Hmong. And then he told him that he had changed it. He said the words he had actually used. He said what they meant. He said that his mother had spent the last 2 hours of her life believing there was time, and that she had used that time to talk about a birthday party in March, and that he had let her, and that when it happened at 7:05 she had been in the middle of a sentence about a cake. He said that he had never told anybody that. Not Auntie. Not Grandma. Not one person at the funeral. He said, "I did it because I couldn't stand to say the true thing to her face, and I've been telling myself for 3 years that I did it to give her a good afternoon. But it wasn't mine to give." The kitchen was very quiet. B sat there with the receipt in his hand. Then he said, "Was she scared?" "No," Chai said. "She wasn't. That's the part I did on purpose. But she didn't get to say things." "No." B nodded slowly. He looked at the receipt for a long moment, and then he picked up his pencil off the table and wrote today's date under the old one, so that there were 2 dates on the back of a blank gray slip of paper. The day he'd heard it, and the day he'd finally been told. Then he said the thing. He said it without any weight at all, the way 7-year-olds say the things that take the top of your head off. "You're not going to do that to me, right?" Chai said no, because I'd rather know. "I know you would. Even if it's bad. Even if it's bad." B put the lid back on the shoebox and pushed it about an inch toward the middle of the table, which Chai understood, correctly, to be an offering. "Are you going to go back to the ginseng place?" Chai looked at his hands. "They won't let me in the building," he said. B frowned at him. "That's not what I asked." He went at 10 in the morning, unshowered in the same coat. Not to the plant. He didn't have to guess where she was. He'd read 206 books worth of her father's handwriting, and he knew where the Cluck ground was. And he knew that the block came out in 9 days. She was standing at the end of row 4 in a canvas coat with her hands in her pockets, alone, looking down a shade garden the length of a football field. She saw the truck. She didn't move. He came down the row and stopped about 6 feet away and said, "In Hmong, I quit Northline this morning." She said, "That was stupid." "Yes, they had you at a school. It was a job. It was." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, 8 days. "You didn't call. You didn't either. I was told that if I called you, the carrier issue would follow you to your next account and you would be unemployable in this county by Christmas." Her mouth twisted. "Selk told me that. He was right. He is right about almost everything, which is the single most infuriating thing about him." Chai absorbed that. "He came to my house." "I know. He told me that too." She looked back down the row. "He tells me everything, Chai. That's the thing nobody believes. He has never once lied to me. He has just, every single time, decided what I could carry." The wind came across the top of the shadecloth and moved it. "I need to ask you something," Chai said, "and I need the whole thing, not the short one." "All right. Do you actually think you're going to speak English again? Or is this about the crop?" She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "In Hmong, Vitali told me the singing is a compensation, not a recovery. That I am building a scaffold, not a wall." She said it kindly, and she has data, and she has never once been wrong about me. "That's not what I asked." "I know." She took her hands out of her pockets. I think, she said, that I have spent 14 months being told what the ceiling is by people who have every reason to be right and no reason at all to be curious. And I think the last person in my life who was curious about me is dead, and I answered his last question in the wrong language. On purpose. She looked at him. I don't know if I'll speak English again. I know that 11 words came out of me inside a tune, and that nobody in the state of Wisconsin was interested in that except a man with a mop. She started walking down the row and he walked with her. They're going to take the crop, she said. 8 days. Maybe 7, if it comes in early. Then we stop it in 7. With what? And Xiong said, with the interpreter. Pang Foa Her was 29 and worked at a dental office in Weston, and had not accepted an interpreting assignment in 11 months. Cheryl gave up the name in about 4 seconds, which told Chai everything about how long Cheryl had been waiting for somebody to ask. She met them at a coffee place on Grand Avenue on a Friday afternoon, and she sat down and did not take her coat off and said, before anyone had said anything, "Is this about August?" Yes, Chai said. She closed her eyes. What Pang Foa Her told them took 40 minutes, and she cried twice and apologized both times. And both times Mai Yer reached over with her left hand and put it flat on the table next to her. Not on her, next to her. Which is a thing you can do in that language without saying anything at all. She had been assigned by the agency. Medical legal, 1 session. Assigning. She had arrived at the office and been given, by a paralegal, a 1-page document headed Summary of Instrument, plain language, 11 bullet points, and had been told that the client was 6 weeks out from a CVA. That her attention span was very limited, and that the family had asked that the session be kept brief and non-taxing. She had asked to see the actual instrument. She had been told it was 11 pages, and that reading it aloud would take 40 minutes, and that the client would not track it. And Pang Foa Her, 28 years old, 4 months out of certification, in a room with a notary and a paralegal and a lawyer, and a woman in a wheelchair who could not object, had done what she was told. She had interpreted the summary sheet, and then she had signed, at the bottom of the certificate, the standard attestation, which said that she had interpreted the foregoing instrument to the principal in the Hmong language, and that the principal had indicated understanding. That's false, she said. I signed a false certificate. I have known that every day for 14 months. Did you keep it? Chai said. She reached into her bag. She had kept the summary sheet. She had kept her session notes, timed, in her own hand, which showed a 19-minute session for an 11-page instrument. She had kept the agency assignment sheet. She had kept a copy of the certificate she signed. She put all of it on the table in a coffee shop on Grand Avenue and said, I've had this in a drawer under a phone book for over a year. I quit the day after. I told the agency I was going back to school. She looked at Mai Yer. I've thought about writing to you probably 100 times. And every time I got to the part where I'd have to explain what I did. Mai Yer said something in Hmong. Pang Foa looked at Chai to render it, out of habit, and then stopped, and flushed, because she had understood every word of it herself. What Mai Yer had said was, you are the 11th person they hired to speak for me, and you are the first one who kept the evidence. The lawyer's name was Delia Ostrovsky, out of Wausau, and what she said when she'd read it all twice was that this was not, unfortunately, a case. Not in the time available. A power of attorney can be attacked for lack of informed consent, and this one had a soft belly, but attacking it meant a petition, and a hearing, and a judge's calendar, and the crop was coming out of the ground in 5 days. So we don't attack it, Chai said. Everyone looked at him. They're not going to take it out of the ground themselves, he said. Thornberry's not a digger. They're a buyer. They send a trailer and a check, and they take delivery. Right? Right, so don't fight Selk. Don't fight the POA. He looked at the papers on the table. Send all of this to Thornberry. Delia Ostrovsky sat back in her chair. Because that was the whole thing, and it took her about 4 seconds to see it, and Chai watched it land. Thornberry Botanical Group, was going to take delivery of a $400,000 crop under an instrument whose interpreter's certificate was, on its face, false, with a timed session note proving a 19-minute reading of an 11-page document, and a summary sheet that the seller's own counsel had drafted. Thornberry's title to that crop would be under a cloud on the day they took it. It would still be under a cloud in Illinois, in a blending tank, mixed with 4 other growers' root, uncuttable and unreturnable and impossible to value. No procurement man on earth signs for that. Not to be moral about it. Just because it's a bad trade. Warner Tice doesn't need to lose, Chai said. He just needs to see the paper. The letter went out on a Monday. The freeze came in on a Wednesday night. Not the hard one. The first one. A light one that whitened the tops and went out by 9 in the morning, and every grower in Marathon County stood in his yard that morning and looked at the sky and did arithmetic. Thornberry's counsel called Delia Ostrowski at 2:40 on Thursday afternoon and said that in light of a documentation irregularity, Thornberry Botanical Group was electing not to close and would be withdrawing the trailer, which left the Iron Creek Ginseng Company 4 days out from a harvest window with 40 acres of 4-year root in the ground and no buyer. Which was, Chai understood, standing in the hallway outside Delia Ostrowski's office at 2:45 on a Thursday, listening to Maier Vong not say anything at all. A much, much worse problem than the one they just solved. B named it on a Saturday. They were all in the barn office at Iron Creek, which was where everything happened now. Because Selk had, in a gesture Chai never entirely got the measure of, simply stopped objecting to Chai's presence in the building, and had told the carrier that the individual was a contractor of the company, which was true as of that Thursday, and which cost Arden Selk something he never mentioned. There were 9 growers, and Cheryl, and Delia, and Pangfoa, and Maier, and Chai, and a 7-year-old sitting on an upturned crate with a box of receipts because there was nowhere else for him to be. They had 4 days and no buyer, and what they had instead was 206 grading books and a list, and the list was the thing. Because the books had the 22 families in them, every one of them, names, ground, yields, what they'd been paid, the year they'd gone. And 19 of those families were still in Marathon County, and 11 of them were still growing, and every single one of them was selling into the same bulk channel Iron Creek had just been saved from, for the same fifth of the price. For the same reason. Because the sorting, and the grading, and the buyers, and the paperwork, and the whole apparatus that turns a root into Wisconsin root, was conducted, top to bottom, in a language they could not argue in. Maier laid it out for 2 hours. Iron Creek would not sell the crop bulk. Iron Creek would dig it, and sort it, and grade it by hand the way her father had, and sell it direct. And it would do it with 50 people, which it did not have, unless the 50 people were the families that had walked away over 20 years. And they would come back only if the contract they were signing was one they could read. Tong Yang said, in Hmong, that he had signed 9 contracts with this company and had never once known what was in one. Sia Thao's son said, in English, that his mother had walked out of this office in 2013 and had never told the family why, and that he had found out the reason 40 minutes ago from a book. Maynard Cluck said, "You need frames. I've got frames." And in the middle of it, B. Xiong, who had been sitting on a crate for 2 hours listening to 2 languages go back and forth across a table, said, out loud, to the room, "Why don't they just say it both ways?" The room stopped. Chai said, "B, no." "But why?" B said. He pointed at the stack of contracts on the table, which nobody had touched. You said it in English, and then she said it in Hmong, and then you said the Hmong one in English and everybody understood. So why isn't the paper like that? Why is the paper only one way? Nobody answered him for about 5 seconds. Then Delia Ostrowski, who billed by the hour and had been doing this for 22 years, said, "Because nobody's ever made us." Maier Vong was looking at the boy. She said, in Hmong, "Ask him what he'd call it." Chai said, "She wants to know what you'd call it." B said, "Both ways." And that was the name. And nobody ever proposed another one. What both ways actually was, on paper, was 4 sentences added to every grower agreement Iron Creek issued. That the agreement existed in Hmong and English. That neither version controlled over the other. That it would be read aloud in full in the signer's language before signing. And that the reading would be recorded and kept with the contract. That was it. 4 sentences. It cost the company about $1,100 a year in interpreter time. 22 families had left over 20 years for want of 4 sentences. 16 of them came back inside 9 days. They dug the Cluck block starting on the 17th of November, 4 days before the hard freeze went in, with 140 people on the ground. That number was never really explained to anybody's satisfaction. 9 growers had come to a meeting. 16 families had signed. 140 people showed up. There were cousins. There were sons-in-law. There were 3 men from the co-op who took vacation days. Maynard Cluck brought a tractor and a grandson and sat in the cab all day because at 78 he could no longer bend over, but could absolutely still drive. They dug for 4 days. If you have never seen it, it does not look like a harvest. It looks like an excavation. The digger comes down the row behind a tractor and lifts the whole bed about 8 inches and shakes it. And what comes up out of black Wisconsin dirt is a tangle of pale forked things that look uncomfortably like people. Arms, legs, a body, a neck where the stem was. That's the whole reason the crop is worth what it's worth. 4,000 miles away. Somebody a very long time ago noticed that it looked like a man and decided that meant something. Behind the digger come the hands. That part has not changed since 1981 and cannot be changed because a machine cannot tell a 4-year root from a broken one and cannot be trusted not to snap a fork. So people walk the row bent over, in pairs, and pick. And the ones who have done it since they were children go twice as fast as the ones who haven't, and do not straighten up nearly as often. It got down to 19 degrees on the second night. There was frost in the rows at 7 in the morning, and it burned off by 9, and everybody kept working through both. On the second afternoon, a woman named Dorothy Peel, who had grown for Xiong Vang from 1988 to 2001, and had come out because her nephew told her to, straightened up in the middle of row 11 with about 6 pounds of root in her apron, and started crying. And then got embarrassed about it, and went and sat in her car for 20 minutes. And then came back, and worked until dark. Nobody made anything of it. That was one of the things Chai loved about that field, in retrospect. 140 people, and not one of them made anything of anybody. B came out on the 3rd day, because there was nowhere else to put him, and because he had asked 11 times. They gave him a bucket. That is the traditional job for a 7-year-old in a ginseng field, and it has been the traditional job for a 7-year-old in a ginseng field for as long as there have been ginseng fields, and it consists of walking behind the pickers and getting the ones they missed, which are always there, and which the pickers leave on purpose about 1/3 of the time so the kid has something to find. He found 406. He counted them. Of course he counted them. He announced the number at the end of the day standing on the running board of Maynard Cluck's tractor with dirt to his elbows and a face like a person who has finally been given a real thing to do, and 140 exhausted people applauded a 7-year-old for 406 roots. And Chai stood at the end of row 9 and had to look at the sky for a second. On the 3rd night, around 11, something happened that Chai never told anybody about, except one person. Much later. He had been up for 31 hours. He was interpreting at the grading tables, which is not how interpreting is supposed to work, standing up, in a cold room, in noise, moving between 4 conversations, and a question came in from one of the co-op men about the off-grade tally. And Ma Yer answered it. She answered it long. 40 seconds, maybe more. There was a whole explanation in there about why off-grade from a 4-year block gets counted separately from off-grade out of a 5, and what her father had done with it, and what she wanted done with it this year, and it had 3 parts and a reason attached to each part. And Chai Xiong stood there with his hands full and his eyes burning, and heard, very clearly, in his own head, in his own voice, a short version. 12 seconds. Clean. Accurate. Even. It would have carried the meaning. The man had asked a tally question and he'd have gotten a tally answer, and everyone would have gone back to work and the night would have been 11 seconds shorter. It was right there. It was the easiest thing in the world. He stood in it for about 2 full seconds. Then he set down what he was holding, so his hands would be empty. And he said, "Hang on." She said a long thing. "I'm going to give you all of it." And he gave the man all of it. 41 seconds, 3 parts, reason attached to each part. The co-op man listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "That's actually a better system," and wrote it down. Chai went and stood in the loading bay for 90 seconds afterward with his hands on his knees, and did not entirely understand why he was shaking. The ground held on the 3rd night and gave up on the 4th. They got it all. And every root of it went onto stainless tables in a cold room and got graded by hand, 4-year and 5-year, prime and select and off-grade, by people who had done exactly this work for Chongbang in 1991 and had not been asked since. She worked the tables and interpreted at the same time, which is not possible, and which he did anyway for 4 days on about 11 hours of total sleep. On the 3rd night, at around 2 in the morning, with the room full and loud and the smell of it so thick you could taste it, Ma Yervong came down the aisle between tables 2 and 3 with a mug of tea in her left hand and set it on the stainless next to him without a word and kept walking. He watched her go down the row. She stopped at the end where Xia Thao, the mother, 71 years old, who had walked out of that office in 2013 with a contract she couldn't read and had not set foot in the building since, was grading with both hands, fast, the way somebody does a thing they learned at 11 years old. Ma Yer stood there, and then she said something to her in Hmong, and Xia Thao said something back, and Ma Yer put her weak right hand flat on the table, and the old woman put her hand next to it, not on it, next to it, and they stood there like that for a second, in the middle of 140 people, and then both of them went back to work. Chai drank the tea. He would think about that tea for years, actually, not the moment with Xia Thao. The tea. The fact that a woman who had run a company for 11 years and could not reliably say the word shipment had crossed a cold room at 2 in the morning to put a mug down beside a man's hand without saying anything at all. And that he had understood every single thing about it. He found her at 4, out at the end of the loading dock, sitting on an upturned crate in the cold. He sat down on the concrete next to the crate. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then she said, in Hmong, "What is this?" "What?" "This. Us. I don't have a word for it, and it's bothering me." Chai looked out at the yard lights and the trucks and the shade frames stacked in the dark. "I don't think it needs one yet," he said. "I've spent 14 months not having words for things," she said. "I'd like one." He thought about it. "You put a cup of tea down next to my hand at 2 in the morning," he said. "And I knew exactly what you meant. And you didn't say anything. And neither did I." She was quiet. "That's the whole thing," he said. "That's all it is. It's the first thing in 3 years I haven't had to translate." Ma Yervang sat with that. Then she said, "All right," and did not ask again. And after a minute she reached over, with the right hand, the weak one, which took her a second to close, and took hold of the frayed gray string on his wrist, and turned it a little between 2 fingers, the way you'd check a knot. "This is 3 years old," she said. "Yes, you know what it's for. Yes, you know it's supposed to come off." Chai looked at it. "I know," he said. "I've known the whole time." The Cluck block graded out at 61% prime, which was the best block Iron Creek had put through that room since 2009. Sold direct to 2 Hong Kong buyers her father had opened accounts with in 1994, and 1 Chicago wholesaler who had been quietly buying Iron Creek root for 11 years, without ever once being told where it came from, It brought in something in the neighborhood of 4 times what Thornberry had contracted to pay for it green. Delia Ostrowski filed the revocation of the power of attorney on the 8th of December. Arden Selk signed the acknowledgement the same morning, in the conference room, in front of everybody. And then he sat down and said he had 2 things to say, and that he'd like them in the minutes. The first was that the interim president's role was concluded as of the 31st, and he would stay through it to close the books. The second was that he had, over 14 months, approved the practice of recording summaries of the president's statements in the corporate minutes, that he had believed at the time it was the only way to keep a record at all, and that he had been wrong, and that he wanted the last 14 months of minutes flagged in the book as incomplete. There was no speech attached to it. He said it the way a man reads a weight off a scale. Then he asked Cheryl if she'd gotten all of it, and she said she had. And he said, "In both, please," and went back to his notes. The first both ways contract was signed on the 11th of December in the barn office at Iron Creek, and it was signed by Sia Thao, 71, who had walked out of that building in 2013 and had taken 13 years to come back through the door. It was read aloud first. All 11 pages of it. That was the whole point. Chai read it. It took 51 minutes and there were 9 people in the room, and nobody left, and nobody looked at a phone. And at the end of it, when the old woman had signed, and the recorder had been stopped, Ma Yervang stood up at the head of the table to say the thing a president says. Everybody waited. She had not spoken in front of a room in English in 17 months. She had her left hand flat on the table. Her right one, the weak one, was closed around the edge of it. She looked down at the wood for what felt like a long time, and was probably 4 seconds, and Chai, sitting 3 feet away with a stack of paper in front of him, ready, the way he had been ready for weeks, did not move and did not help. That was the hardest thing he did that year. Not helping, and then she found the tune. You could see her find it. It went through her shoulders first. Whatever the song was, and he never asked, not once, not ever. In all the years after, she got underneath it. And she came up inside it. And what came out of Ma Yervang was not singing and it was not speech, but it had 4 beats in it. And it was English. My name is Ma Yervang. A breath. I am here. 9 words. Nobody clapped. Because they did not understand what they had just seen. 8 of the 9 people in that room had never heard her speak English, and had no way of knowing that 11 months of clinical documentation said this could not happen, and would have said, if you asked them, that the boss had said her name. Chai Xiong put his hand over his mouth and kept it there. Pong Foa Hair, at the far end of the table, was crying with no sound at all. And Mai Yer sat down, and pulled the second contract toward her, and said, in Hmong, in a completely level voice, Tong Yang's is next. Read it, which is the single most Ma Yervang thing she ever did. 9 words was where it stayed for a long time. That is worth saying plainly, because this is not the kind of story where somebody wakes up cured. It came back in inches, and it came back inside music, and she used the scaffold for the rest of her life, and never pretended it was a wall. There were rooms where she used chai, and rooms where she used the tune, and rooms where she used a legal pad, and by the following spring there were about 40 English words she could get to without help. Most of them nouns. Most of them about ginseng. Dr. Colleen Vitali came back to the case in February. She read the recordings. She watched 2 sessions. And then, she did the thing that separates a good clinician from a merely correct one, which was to write, in her own file, in her own hand, that her prior recommendation to discontinue expressive English work had been based on a reasonable reading of the evidence, and had been wrong for this patient, and that she was revising the plan of care. She and Chai were, eventually, friendly. It took about a year. The strings got tied at the end of January, at the barn, on a Saturday, with about 60 people there, and 4 tables of food, and a space cleared in the middle of the concrete floor. It was a small thing. It was not for anything exactly. Not a wedding, not a funeral. An old man from the Thao family, who was 86 and had done this at every event in that county for 40 years, sat in a folding chair with a bowl of white cotton string in his lap, and people came up and held out their wrists, and he said the words over them and tied them on, calling the soul back, telling it that it was wanted here, and that it should stay. Chai stood at the back for most of it. B found him there, the way B always found him. Are you going to? I've got one. That's not a one, B said, which was accurate. What was on his father's wrist was a gray fuzz with a knot in it, 3 years old, worn down to almost nothing at the back where it rubbed. Chai looked at it. Then he took out his pocket knife, and he put the blade under it, and he cut it. It came off in one piece and did not fall. It stuck to his sleeve, the way that string does, and he took it off his sleeve and held it in his palm for a second. 3 years of it, and then folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, because there are things you do not throw away, and there are things you do not wear. Then he went and sat down in front of the old man and held out his wrist and let it be done properly. When he stood up, Ma Yer was there. She had one already. Somebody had done hers 10 minutes before. She was holding a second one. B said, "Can I?" And Ma Yer Vang, who ran a company, who had been unable to give a 7-year-old the second letter of a word 4 months before, said, in English, slowly, one word at a time, without any tune under it at all, 4 of the 40 she had. "Yes, you do. It B tied it." He did it badly. It took him a while, and he ran the ends through twice because he wasn't sure. And Chai stood there with his own new string white as paper on his wrist, and let his son take as long as he needed. Nobody rushed him. That was the whole of it, really. Nobody in that barn rushed anybody, in either language, for the entire afternoon. When B finally got the knot to hold, he sat back on his heels and looked at his work. And then he pulled a receipt and a pencil out of his coat pocket, and wrote something on the back of it, and handed it up to Ma Yer. She read it. Then she turned it around so Chai could see. It said President, spelled all the way out, all 10 letters, in a 7-year-old's careful uppercase. And under it, the date. There is a version of this story that gets told as a rescue, the janitor who saved the company, the man who walked into a building where nobody could hear a woman, and heard her, and everything changed. It's a clean version. It has a hero in it and a direction the grace flows in, and it would fit on a plaque. It isn't what happened. What happened is that a woman spent 20 years deciding that one of the 2 languages she owned was a cost, and then lost the other one, and had to sit inside the exact silence she had built for everybody else. And a man spent 3 years believing that the safest thing he could do with a hard sentence was make it a little kinder on the way through, and then met somebody who had been on the receiving end of 1,000 kindnesses exactly like it. Neither of them fixed the other one. They just stopped shortening. That's the whole mechanism, and it's smaller and more ordinary than a rescue. 18 interpreters walked through that building, and 14 of them quit. And not one of those 14 was incompetent. They quit because they were good. Because every day somebody reasonable and well-meaning asked them for the gist, and they gave it, and they went home, and could not sleep, knowing that the record now said something a person had not said. Nobody in that building was a villain. That's the part worth sitting with. The lawyer was thorough. The clinician was right about the evidence. The interim president kept the doors open through a year that would have closed most companies. Every link in the chain was doing its job, and the chain came out the other end with a woman who could not be heard in her own office, and a crop headed for a blending tank in Illinois. Cruelty doesn't usually announce itself. Mostly it arrives as efficiency. What Xiong gave Ma Yer Vang was not his voice. She had a voice. What he gave her was the refusal to trim it. He sat in a room and rendered 19 seconds of her sentence, when 4 seconds would have been easier for everybody including him, and he did that over and over until the room got used to it, and that was the entire contribution. Not brilliance. Not rescue. Length. And what she gave him was the thing he had not been able to give himself, which was a use for the exact injury he was carrying. He had spent 3 years certain that what he'd done at his wife's bedside disqualified him. It didn't. It was the qualification. There is nobody on earth who guards a sentence harder than a man who once shaved one. Xiong understood all of it before either adult did, which is normal, because he was 7 and had not yet learned to be gentle with the truth. He had been keeping a box of the words nobody would give him, with the dates on them for 3 years. Not to be dramatic, just because he assumed the answers were coming and wanted to know how long the wait had been. Every one of us is carrying a box like that. Somebody, somewhere along the line, decided you couldn't handle the whole thing. They meant well. They almost always mean well. And they gave you the short version. And you took it. And you built part of your life on a sentence that had a piece missing out of the middle of it. The people who change your life are almost never the ones who save you. They're the ones who refuse to make you smaller so the room can move faster. Who let you finish, who read all 11 pages out loud at a table at 9 o'clock at night when everybody already knows what's in them. Because you are entitled to the whole thing and not the gist of it. That is not a grand kind of love. It's a slow one. And it is mostly made of not interrupting. But it's the only kind that ever gave anybody their name back. If somebody in your life ever gave you the whole thing, when the short version would have been so much easier for them, say their name in the comments and tell me the town you're watching from. I read every one of them. Description: 18 interpreters came through the doors of the Iron Creek Ginseng Company in 14 months. The first lasted 9 days. The shortest lasted 40 minutes. By the end of that year, 2 agencies in the state had stopped returning the company's calls, and the woman they'd all been hired for sat in a corner office nobody could hear. Maier Vang built her father's ginseng farm into a company that shipped Wisconsin root around the world. Then, at 40, a stroke took one language and left the other. She could read every word anyone wrote to her. She could not say one back. And every night at 10:40, a man came in with a mop, understood every word she said, and for 11 weeks said nothing at all. This is a slow, warm, 2-hour story about dignity. A 7-year-old who kept a box of the words nobody would give him. And what happens in a room when one person refuses to make another person smaller so the room can move faster? Settle in. This one takes its time on purpose. If somebody in your life ever gave you the whole thing when the short version would have been easier, say their name in the comments, and tell me the town you're watching from. Tap like if you're staying to the end. Subscribe for a new full-length story every week. Chapters 00000. The Building at Night, 1840. 11 Weeks of Not Saying Anything, 4620. The Grading Books, 10800. Page 4, 13115. The Word on the Back of a Receipt, 15230. Both ways, 20300. 9 words. All characters, companies, and events in this story are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons or businesses is coincidental. Tags: Single Dad Story, Emotional Story, CO Love Story, Clean Romance Audiobook, Family Drama Story, Single Father, Heartwarming Stories, Stories Before Sleep, Long Story to Fall Asleep to, Dignity, Workplace Story, Second Chance Story, Slow Burn Romance Story, Feel Good Story, Emotional Audio Story, Best Stories 2026, Wholesome Story, Story for Adults, Midwest Story, Small Town Story, Farm Story, Wisconsin Story, Interpreter Story, Language Barrier Story, Aphasia Story, Stroke Recovery Story, Immigrant Family Story, Father and Son Story, Quiet Love Story, Refusal, Being Underestimated, Life-Changing Story, Uplifting Stories, Bedtime Story for Grown-Ups, Narrated,